Good evening. I am Dr. Sundiata Kaita Chajua, and this is Real Talk, History as a Weapon for Black Liberation. And today's guest is none other than Dr. William Santiago-Valles. Dr. Valles was here about 5 weeks ago, and we had a wonderful, stimulating discussion. And so he's back so that we can complete a discussion centered around the work of the Egyptian Marxist scholar Samir Amin. Dr. Santiago-Valles, William, my brother.
How are you?
Good to see you again, brother.
Good to see you too.
So, my brother, I know you were just here, but the way things probably work, I could never tell who we're going to have on, nor where they are. So that means then that I've got to reintroduce you, right?
Fine.
And we'll cover a little bit of the ground that we covered on March, I believe it was March 12th. Yeah? So for our listeners, Dr. William F. Santiago-Valles is Emeritus Associate Professor at State University of Kalamazoo, Michigan, now a visiting professor both in the University of Michigan, Dearborn, and at the Graduate School of Senegal's National University, where he is on the editorial board of the African Studies Journal. Since 2015, Dr. Santiago-Valles has conducted research on A, Vulture funds strangling U.S. domestic and overseas colonies, and B, life in exile of Cuban General Antonio Maceo. Dr. Santiago has a PhD in political economy and another in cultural history. He also worked with Pablo Freire, Ivan Illich, and of course, Samir Amin, who is the subject of our discussion tonight. Now, Dr. Santiago teaches in African diaspora, global studies, anthropology, and education. Is informed by ongoing research on social movements, popular cultures, permanent war regime in this financial stage of declining global empire, and practice research methods that force ruling classes to reveal their coercive state. He has directed a statewide Africana Studies team in the analysis of the 1967 Detroit Rebellion in order to develop university curricular content. Dr. Santiago presently co-directs a curriculum project comparing causes, consequences of globalization in West Africa and the U.S. Midwest, which includes a study abroad course and a face-to-face process that funds urban social justice projects. Brother Santiago, man, good to have you back.
Thank you.
As I kind of said earlier, you were here very recently, and it was such a intellectually stimulating conversation that there was like a demand to bring you back, a upswell from the people, my brother. And so, even though you were just here, right? I still need to cover some standard territory, and it may feel like you're repeating yourself, but I can assure you there'll be some folk who weren't here previously. So I need you to talk briefly about your own biography. I need you to put it in the context of Dr. Bill Cross's negrescence theory, or Negro to Black conversion process, or the development of Black identity theory. I want you to keep it short and tight because you know we've done it before. So I want you to hit the highlights. So, my brother, who are you, and how did you become the scholar activist that you are today?
My father's family is from a maroon village in the central mountain range in Puerto Rico. And my oldest relative that I met was my great grandfather. My great grandfather was an anarchist and a carpenter, and his son, my grandfather, was a poet and a novelist and a master carpenter as well as a public school teacher, and he was involved in nationalist politics in our country. He was a member of the Puerto Rican equivalent of the Irish Republican Army, a group of people that did not believe in electoral processes. They believed in armed resistance to the American occupation of our country. And my father was one of the first black people from that maroon village to go to university in the colonial capital of our country. And he was a judge and a philosopher and a Protestant minister and a bishop in the Methodist Church in our country, as well as
Elaborate me in terms of years. So when you say your father was one of the first black folk from your village to go to university, what time period are we talking about?
this is the period between 1942 and 1946.
Okay.
And on my mother's side of the family, they're also anarchists from a coastal village in southeastern Puerto Rico, uh, and they were what in the United States is called racially mixed. And my mother's parents migrated to New York, where they lived in such conditions of impoverishment that my grandmother died shortly after my mother was born. And my mother and my uncle were sent to a orphanage in upstate New York because my grandfather had landed a job in the federal postal system in New York City. And for a black man to work in the post office was like being economic royalty, but he couldn't do his job and take care of children who were 3 years old and 6 months old. And in upstate New York, my mother and her brother were not the flavor of the month as far as getting adopted because they were not only black children, but they were also foreigners.
Mm-hmm.
And my grandmother's family in Puerto Rico learned about this and then had them shipped back to our country. And they were raised by uh, a disciple of Booker T. Washington, which created some cognitive dissonance,
I'm sure it did.
and an anarchist woman, and they worked in a mountain village where there were only three black families. One of them was ours, and so my mother grew up in a town that was like living in South Africa or in Mississippi or in Palestine today, uh, whereas my father grew up in a maroon village where we sort of controlled our lives. And when they met, it was like sweet sugar because they sort of needed each other. My mother's family had black intellectuals and black teachers for the last 200 years in the history of our country. And so they were educators. And this Booker T. Washington disciple uh, started me as a teacher when I was about 3 years old. I had to teach the chickens that he had in the backyard, and my grandfather would give me a lesson plan, and he would sit in the back. And after I developed my lesson, he would criticize what I had taught the chickens. And
So
as soon as
if you pour into yourself and maybe in a few minutes, kind of succinctly tell us who you are. today and how you became yourself?
I'm the product of that history of efforts to achieve national sovereignty by whatever means necessary. And as a West Indian, I am part of a region of the world where 95% of the people in the African diaspora live and where we have lived for the last 500 years. And as someone who comes from the country with the first slave rebellion in the New World, I understand perfectly what colonialism looks like and what armed resistance looks like, and the place of knowledge production and access to information in order to create knowledge that represents our own interest.
So I do want to take this slight kind of diversion to delve into. So, Brother Santiago, the biography you just gave reminds me to some degree the biography of Malcolm X, the biography of Ella Baker, the biography of Robert F. Williams, in the sense that you come from a family tradition of struggle,
Yeah.
right? Now, unfortunately, most of us may come from family traditions in which there may be some lower level form of info politics, but not, strong traditions of resistance that are taught, right? So that's a unique background. So what I'd like you to do is say, give me a sense of, for the folks who did not come out of that highly politicized background as yourself, how did you see of those people that you know who became politicized? How did that happen for them?
Uh,
You're
there,
born into it in a certain degree. You know what I'm saying?
yeah, there was a colleague of mine at the National University in Puerto Rico who is also of African descent, and he had attended Harvard University, where he studied medicine and psychiatry. And he said something that helped me understand uh, the phenomena that you're referring to. He said that when you come from a place where you're brainwashed into thinking that you're the cowboy in the movie,
Mm.
and you go somewhere else, and as soon as you get to the airport or to the shipyard, somebody there, some white supremacist tells you, uh, listen, this is not a movie, this is real life, and here you're the Indian. So put these feathers in your afro and move on. And
Mm.
what happens to
Mm.
that person's way of seeing him or herself is similar to what happened to Fanon when he got to France. And
Mhm.
a little boy said, "Mom, there's a Negro." And you have to rethink all the assumptions and redefine all the vocabulary and discover that if you're going to think for yourself, you have to connect consequences with causes. And that process of epistemological uh, transformation is what makes it possible for other people who have not had that background of, like my mother's father would
Mhm.
go to church with a revolver in his pocket, and he'd tell my mother and my uncle, we're going to go to church now, and if anybody asks us to get off the sidewalk into the mud, I'm going to shoot them dead, and then we'll continue on our way to church.
Oppressors will produce their own grave diggers, in other words.
Yeah. Or my great grandfather in my father's village who had about a 10-foot pole with a red flag on it, which announced to everybody in the village that he was a communist.
Mm. Mm. Good, good. So now I want to get to some questions, and I want to start with this very podcast, right? The title of my podcast, after the Real Talk, which we all know as African American colloquialism, keep it 100, Real Talk, etc. But the part that's after the colon, history as a weapon for Black liberation, was inspired by a quote from Samir Amin in what is it? Class and Nation historically and in the current crisis, and from a quote by Walter Rodney. Two giants, right? Two giants. Walter Rodney publishing an article entitled "African History in the Service of Black Liberation." So those were the two things in my mind when I created the title for this podcast. So can you talk about how, because both of those, the quote from Samir Amin, which is history is a weapon in the ideological battle between those who want to change society and those who want to maintain its basic features, right? And again, it's coming from one of my favorite Amin books, Class and Nation, Historically and in the Current Crisis. And then, of course, Rodney about African history being in the service of liberation. So, what both suggest is a rejection of the notion that history is objective, right? The objective study of history, a positivist view. So, can you unpack Amin and maybe Rodney's understanding of history as a weapon?
I think all of us as individuals or as communities, I don't think this process of becoming black is a process that can be solved alone, or it's not an individual pursuit. So this way, I'm telling you that I've read some of Cross since our last meeting.
I appreciate it, and I read what you sent me, my brother. Now, comradeship and education.
Fine. So I think we have to distinguish between people who want to rock the boat in order to be recognized and be given a seat at the table, and those of us who want to sink the boat. And history is useful in that process because we can, and again here I'm referring to my good friend Cedric Robinson, may he rest in peace, uh, whose book Black Marxism is about what is it that we can learn from the victories of our ancestors. We don't have to imitate the struggles of European workers or Canadian workers or white settlers in North America, Central and South America. We can look at the victories of our ancestors and figure out how we can adapt that process of becoming sovereign and self-sufficient into the present. And that's what history is good for. It helps us connect with those victorious and successful efforts of our ancestors.
I really appreciate that answer. Now, were you getting ready to elaborate?
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead. Go ahead, my brother. Go ahead.
And one of the ways in which history can become a tool in order to sink this boat, which is on its way down to the bottom of the ocean quite on its own. Our job is to accelerate the process and build an alternative. While we're at it, we have to do both. Part of that process is, again, identifying the premises or the assumptions of the time period in which we're forced to live in, and how we can dismantle those assumptions and those premises based on our an understanding of history that serves our own needs as opposed to being brainwashed into submission. The second way in which we can use history is to redefine the vocabulary. There are over 340, 350 million people in this country, and if you ask any of them to define democracy. They may be able to give you an example from a book, but they will not be able to produce a definition that serves our own interests, that serves the
Mm,
interest of our community. And so, again, in addition to challenging the premises based on an understanding of history that serves our needs, the second way in which we can use history as a tool is to redefine the vocabulary. When we talk about democracy, when we talk about self sufficiency, when we talk about sovereignty, we have to define that vocabulary in a way that satisfies our own goals and addresses our own needs. And the third way in which we use history as a tool is in being able to connect the consequences of illiteracy, infant mortality, homelessness,
mm,
structural unemployment with the causes. And
mhm, mhm.
and identifying the causes means that people who focus on only one aspect of the present, which is undoing racism, if you identify the causal relations, then it's possible to conclude that you cannot dismantle racism without dismantling the economic regime that makes racism profitable.
And that would be capitalism.
Capitalism has to be sunk. That's the ship that has to be sunk.
And when it goes down, racism will go down with it, but there might
Yeah,
be residuals that
yeah,
have
and
to
then
themselves be destroyed.
exactly.
Okay, thank you, sir. Thank you. Thank you. Now, I want to shift to the purpose of our conversation today, and that was to talk about a great man who I think that a particular type of Marxist, political, economist oriented intellectual is aware of, right? But I don't know that the regular, everyday, dries long soul, black radical revolutionary has read Amin or understand Samir Amin's contribution, and clearly it's not a contribution understood by the mass. So, Santiago, you knew Samir Amin personally, and you
Yes.
studied and worked with Amin. So, can you tell me how did you come to know this world historical uh, activist intellectual? And you can you provide some of his biographical background, and then briefly also talk about locate him as a activist as well as a theorist, an activist intellectual.
First, let me say about how I met him or how I became aware of his work. When I was studying my first PhD in political economy, I spent a lot of time in Mexico City at the National University. And this starts in the fall of 1973, and I was there writing my dissertation until the winter of 1979. And a lot of the professors who were in sociology, political science, Latin American studies, Caribbean studies were exiles from Haiti, from Chile, from Brazil, from Argentina, or people who were visiting professors from Cuba. And in the fall of 1973, the United States government had orchestrated so many coups in Latin America that the majority of progressive intellectuals were at the National University in Mexico City. And so my teachers were the people who founded dependency theory
Ah,
post the 1950s and 1960s. I didn't study with Presbich or I didn't study with Cardoso and Faleto, who were bureaucrats for the United Nations proposing substitution of imports with local production. That model had been attempted by the colonial administration in Puerto Rico, and by the 1970s, it was clear to all of us that that failed. And
right.
so the professors thought that I was like a guinea pig. I was the dude that could tell all our classmates how that first version of alternatives to economic dependency had failed. And they were developing, the Brazilians and the Argentinians and the Chileans were developing an alternative way of thinking about dependency theory. And some of the books that we had access to in the bookstores around the universities were translations from French, from English, from Portuguese, and among them there was a book by Samir Amin about desarrollo paralelo y desigual, parallel and unequal development.
Mm.
It was a very thick book that we could use it to hold the doors in our uh, squalid apartments. And
A
and
couple of those.
and I mean came once in a while to Latin America, to the Latin American Council of Social Sciences that was developed in the 1980s, and he attended some of the meetings of the Latin American Association of Social Scientists. And it was as a result of these conversations with my teachers that he developed a broader understanding of what he had studied in France. His father was Egyptian, but his mother was French. So he
Right.
had dual citizenship, like a whole lot of Egyptians do. And he was able to study in France. He knew the language perfectly, and he was a member of the Egyptian Communist Party, which meant that by the 1960s, 1970s, he had to start finding somewhere else to live because Sadat and his colleagues,
Mm.
after Nasser died, were cleaning house. They were expelling all the people that had a brain like Samir Amin. So again, the way I became acquainted with his work was during the 1970s when I was a student in Mexico. In the 1980s, I taught some of his books at the National University in Puerto Rico. And in the 1990s, when I was studying again in Canada, one of the guest speakers there was Gunder Frank, the
Ah,
German
Frank,
the
yeah.
German American who had worked with Teotonio and with Ruimauro and with Bania in Chile. Teotonio, Ruimauro, and Bania were my teachers. Teotonio and Bania were a married couple who taught us from Lenin's complete works about tactics and strategy, and we were assigned for our doctoral dissertations the history of the communist parties in our respective countries in order to produce like an encyclopedia of what
Yes.
tactics and strategy should look like, and that's what I did. And so in the 1990s, when Gunder Frank came to Simon Fraser in Vancouver, one of my teachers who had been his student asked me to come along. And when we talked about Samir Amin, and we talked about Rimauro and Teotonio and Bania, who were the pioneers in dependency theory, together with Gunder Frank himself. Now, after that, I was invited to teach in the United States. This university in Michigan accepted the conditions that I established, and I organized together with my wife and another colleague here a study abroad in Senegal to look at the consequences of globalization and how those consequences were similar to the consequences of globalization in the domestic colonies inside the United States.
Okay, now let
And
me roll you back for a moment. At that time, when you get to Senegal, and I can see perfectly comparing what's happening in the U.S. to what's happening in Senegal in terms of black populations. But had you read Amin's Neocolonialism in West Africa, I'm almost certain you've read Nkrumah, Neocolonialism, the last stage of imperialism. But had you read Amin's work on colonialism in South Africa at that point?
no, I had
When do you meet
read
Amin?
I had read Eurocentrism, and
You had read Vulture.
I
Okay.
had read some of his books about globalization, but I had not read the one about neocolonialism.
Okay, can you get us to when do you meet Amin and what is the work and the study that you do?
In Dakar, we stayed at a hotel that was across the street from the building where he had his offices and where he had his apartment. All I had to do was go across the street,
Ah, yes.
and 2 blocks from where our hotel was the place where he had the office of Third World Forum, and I called his office one day, and I went there and I introduced myself and I said, the first thing I need to tell you is who were my teachers. And I told him I studied with Rui Mauro Marini, with Teotonio dos Santos, with Bania Bambirra, with Edelberto Torres, with Rafael.
Wait a minute. You studied with Dos Santos?
Yes,
Oh man, okay. I missed that shit.
Dos Santos and Rui Mauro and Bania were my teachers in Mexico.
Man, okay.
And so I told him my teachers from El Salvador, from Guatemala, from Brazil. I told them, and for balance, I also studied with the hardline communist Marxists who were in opposition to Teotonio. I studied with them too. And Samir said, "You don't have to say anymore. You're a member of this family." Because those people that you mentioned were my colleagues, my comrades, they're my peers, and whatever you need here, you're welcome. And so I said, I have 2 requests. One, that you tell me if I can speak to Mario Pinto de Andrade's sister in Cape Verde, and he pulled out his phone book. He had a phone book that was bigger than the telephone book for New York City,
Mm.
and he had a section about Cape Verde, and he gave me the way I could get in touch with Mario Pinto de Andrade's sister. Mario Pinto de Andrade was a founder of the Angolan Communist Party, and he was also a member of the MPLA, which he also founded, and he was forced to leave.
And the
Uh,
MPLA was the Movement for the Liberation of Angola.
yes,
Yeah.
and but Mario was forced to leave there, and he was welcomed in Bissau by Amilcar Cabral's comrades. And Senegal, you can swim from Senegal to Cape Verde if you're a good swimmer. And so it was possible for us to visit Mario's sister in Cape Verde thanks to Samir Amin's intervention. And the other thing I asked him for was, I have some students here with me from the United States, and I just want to have a conversation with you that they can listen in on. Is if you're agreeable, I'd like to bring my students so that when we talk, there's people here taking notes of the conversation that you and I are going to have. And he agreed. And after that, every year when Yvette and I went to Senegal, we'd see him and his wife at the Vietnamese restaurant where we both ate. He invited us to his house in Paris because since his wife was French, like his mother, he also had an apartment in Paris. And when we talked, I would offer him a Cuban cigar, and we would both smoke in the vestibule of the hotel and have our conversations.
Okay, wow, that is amazing.
he, he organized 2 very important institutions in Africa. One is Codesria, which is a carbon copy of the Latin American Social Science Council, which is the equivalent. It's the Council of Social Scientists in Africa. And when we go there every summer, I go to the bookstore, I talk to the librarian. There was a person there from Bissau for several years. His last name is Cardoso, and he and I had conversations every summer. And another institution that Samir Amin created was a think tank where his library is now located after he died, and that's across the street from Codesria. And if you walk down 2 blocks, is the National University where I teach
And all of that is in Senegal.
in Dakar. Yes,
Huh. Amazing,
we're
amazing,
we're
amazing.
going there in 3 weeks. If you want to come along,
Well, no, you invited me to come next year, right?
you can come next year
Yeah,
too.
I need a year to raise some funds, but I'm looking forward to it. I do have a slight question, then I want to get back to our main discussion.
Yes,
Has the two institutions that he created, have they remained left? Or have
yes,
they, okay, good.
yes. One of the recent presidents of Codesria was a sociologist who is a professor of African Studies at Columbia University named Mahmoud Mamdani.
Oh, yeah, 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 yeah.
He's from Uganda. He was quite recently, the president of Codesria, and the other institutions, which is a think tank that tries to address the economic development, autonomous economic development, not to be confused with economic growth, but
Mhm.
the economic development that provides for the redistribution of wealth that's produced is across the street, and that is called Enda Tiersmond, and that's a think tank, and it's a library where students can go. Students who don't have enough money to buy books for their university work, they
Mhm.
can go there and study with the books in the collective library at Enda Tiersmond.
Yeah, that is amazing. I want to ask you a question about, Amin's work, much of it takes up Marxist political economy, and particularly, I want to go with a quote from Marx about a compulsive globalizing tendency is inherent in the very mode of functioning of capital itself. Okay. And much of Amin's work has been about, well, it's been located in dependency theory, critiques of dependency theory, et cetera, et cetera. Can you talk about this compulsive globalizing tendency of capital and Amin's intervention in exposing that tendency? And then, say something about the implications of this tendency of capitalism for struggles for national liberation.
If you're a well-read Marxist like Samir Amin was, or Bania, or Teotonio, or Rimauro, you start reading Marx and Lenin and Rosa Luxemburgo, this Polish woman who organized a political organization in Germany where she went to graduate school. And the Lenin developed Marxist methodology in order to incorporate what happens when Europe and North America uh, saturate their internal market. What do they do after they don't have any more customers for the trinkets that are spitting out of their factories? And so they have to find markets overseas. And how do you convince people in Latin America, in Africa, and in Asia to buy the trinkets that are produced by Europeans and Canadians and people inside the United States? It's difficult to talk them into accepting trinkets that are more expensive and less durable than what they can produce locally. So you have to force them by forcing them to lower their tariff walls and to expel from the circulation of goods in their domestic markets the goods that they produce. You have to ruin the local factories or the national production network in Africa and Asia and Latin America in order to make the import of foreign goods viable. And you also have to force them to devaluate their currency so that the foreign goods appear to be less expensive than they really are. And that process is what Lenin called imperialism and what Rosa Luxemburg understood just as well, if not better, than Lenin. And that continues to expand, and it has to continuously acquire more markets, more territory, in order to be able to find customers for the excess production in Europe and in North America. And I think,
Let me push you on a couple of things, right?
go
Because
ahead.
what you just said sounds pretty much like Oliver Cox. Now,
Yeah,
we know that Cox is a forerunner of world systems theory and at least a core aspects of dependency theory.
yeah,
Cox emphasizes foreign exchange, foreign trade in much the manner that you just described. Marxists start with
product,
production,
production.
commodity production,
Yeah,
right? And
yeah.
then the need to upload. So they're talking about the exploitation that occurs in the labor relationship. You seem like Cox to be emphasizing um, a type of exploitation that is tied to exchange.
Can I?
And I'm not sure, after reading Amin, I think Amin goes more toward production than exchange, and that's what makes his critique of dependency theory viable and robust. So,
And
so go ahead, my brother.
and I agree with Rui Mauro and with Amin, because Amin's critique of imperialism is parallel or in tandem with Rui Mauro's creation of a concept called super exploitation.
Yes, 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 yes.
Rimauro, Rimauro suggests that what made it possible for imperialism to exponentially grow in its accumulation of wealth is the fact that in Africa, in Asia, and in Latin America, Europeans and North Americans pay the working classes less than the cost of keeping us alive. That
Okay.
is, in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, the working classes are worked to death consciously, and it's part of the design of colonialism. The best and most drastic example is the Belgian Congo.
Yes. Or what one might say, if we back up for a moment, we know that in Haiti specifically, but throughout the Americas, the whole slave regime, the idea was the typical enslaved person before the 19th century lasted only 7 years. And
Yes,
they
and
would
it
simply
was
go back
cheaper.
to the continent and replace them.
It was cheaper to kidnap our ancestors and bring them to the Americas. It was cheaper to do that than to provide adequate uh, health, housing, and nutrition to our ancestors.
Absolutely. So then,
So, this idea of super exploitation that Amin and Rimauro agree with makes it possible for capital to expand, because the margin for profit is extraordinary, and it has less to do with trade than it has to do with what happens in the process of production.
okay, good. That's where I knew you wanted to go. I just wanted to keep you to get there, my brother, because
And so,
otherwise
and
we end up
so
with the dilemma that Cox puts us in. We don't want to be trapped in that cul-de-sac. We want to
I
locate this in production.
agreed. And getting back to something that we discussed earlier, that is why sinking the boat means undoing the production process itself.
Yes.
Not
And
not
the
electing
labor relationship.
not electing black faces to high places. 'Cause that doesn't.
As a quick aside, I can't think of the sister that she's given a commencement address at, I think, Spelman.
Yes,
Maybe it's Morehouse. I'm not sure, but
it
she
was
makes the
Spellman.
point about we got to go beyond black faces in high places, right? Now that's an argument that Jamil Alameen, H. Rap Brown made routinely throughout the '60s, right? And you can hear him make it on the piece that's on the internet called "The Politics of Education." H. Rap Brown, Jamil Alameen, Politics of Education, and she goes through and she points out that the Atlanta black leadership, they support Cop City. He goes on to say the black woman that's the U.S. ambassador voted against a ceasefire in Palestine, and so explodes that myth. I just wanted to jump on that for a minute.
Thank you.
I want to come back and so talk about the implications of what you just said. That capital has a compulsory need to globalize. What are the problems that create for national liberation movements? In other words, when we look at the continent, and particularly the last iteration of the high tide of struggle, right? South Africa and the liberation movement there, what are the consequences when a national liberation movement does not fully grasp the need of capital to constantly globalize?
Uh, the examples that come to mind immediately are both South Africa that you mentioned, as well as Ghana, as well as Angola, as well as Algeria, and and the work that Samir Amin did in a book called Delinking is very there's a book that he wrote in which delinking is the title. And in order to dismantle the capitalist ship, we have to divorce ourselves from the commercial and financial system that feeds this monster, this
Mhm.
uh, eternally expanding global monster. And divorcing ourselves from it requires building alternative institutions, and those alternative institutions cannot be limited to what the Vietnamese did or the Algerians did, which is to create a parallel public safety court, parliamentary education.
Well,
Where
let me jump in here for a minute. I'm struck by something that Nelson Mandela found out. As soon as Mandela took power, the first thing he did was run and see in the world who is trying to continue on the socialist path. And he went to Vietnam and they told him, we're privatizing. He went to China, they said, we're privatizing. So, delinking, who's trying to delink from
uh,
capital?
now the BRICS are making a
Explain
serious
what the bricks are.
Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, plus about 10 more that joined.
Wait,
Excuse me, 6 more that joined last year, 10 more that are going to join this year, and about 40 that are in the queue, or that are in the line. I don't think queue is an American word. But what I think is this process of delinking in its current version is creating an alternative to the SWIFT system that will make international trade possible outside the NATO, European, North America system. And there's going to be a currency that's backed by gold, and the United States dollar will sink. because the United States dollar is backed by nothing, and
Now,
three
Trump got a bullet in the head for trying to do that.
and 3/4 of the world's gold supply is currently in the hands of China, Russia, and Iran and Venezuela
In South Africa.
and South
South Africa is
Africa.
about
Yes,
35% of world gold reserves.
yes.
Okay, so there's an effort to create an alternative system, but Russia is capitalist,
Yeah,
China is state capitalist.
yeah.
So, I mean, I understand why they're there in terms of military, and I understand that, China is very complex. I know that Yi has instituted uh, training in Marx's works from elementary school through college, but we don't see a Marxist approach to economics in China yet.
Uh, I suggest for both you and your audience to explore sources that are not widely circulating in the rigidly censored media landscape in North America and Western Europe in
Oh,
order to find out what is happening in the conversations in the Shanghai Economic Development Bank, or what is happening in the Silk Road Initiative, or what is happening. I'll give one example to be more concrete. The Europeans and the North Americans tell the rest of us in Africa and Asia and Latin America that we should be weary of the Chinese system of loans or foreign
yeah,
aid.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, but if you compare the Chinese system of foreign aid with the World Bank system of loans, or the International Monetary Fund loans, the conditions for anybody who's got the use of their own mind, the conditions of the Chinese loan system is superior, is much better.
Well, that wasn't my argument. I don't doubt that an alliance with what China is attempting to do is the politically smart move. My question simply was that the economy of China, as it currently operates, is state capitalism, as C.L.R. James and Raya Scala and Grace Lee Boggs argued about the Soviet Union back under Stalin. I'm not disputing the possibility that there's something going on in China. I mean, there's no way Yi would mandate the study of Marxism, right, amongst young people if the intent is to continue a state capitalist road. I understand that, but I am talking about the complexity of what currently exists. But you know what, my brother? We do what you and I do. We off topic. We got to come back. We got to come back. So I want to go to this phrase, neocolonialism, and just an interesting bit of history, right? We know that Kwame Nkrumah leads the creation of an all Africa Peoples Conferences, right? Beginning in 57, I think. And by 61, the All African Peoples Conferences are passing resolutions against neocolonialism, right? Now, this is about white folk. In 1964, Jean Paul Sartre, and I had nothing against Sartre, and I know that he began to move from existentialism to Marxism, and I appreciate that. But Sartre publishes a book in 1964 entitled Colonialism and Neocolonialism. Kwame Nkrumah's book, Neocolonialism and the Last Stage of Imperialism, comes out in 65. But clearly, it's probably Nkrumah, Ben Bella, or Sekou Toure, who authors that resolution in 1961 at the All African Peoples Conference against neocolonialism. Yet the white folks give Jean Paul Sartre credit for coining the phrase neocolonial. So I just want to get that little bit out there because that's what white people do. They take your shit. I want to come back here now and talk about Amin in describing neocolonialism in West Africa. He uses this very, what I think is a very potent phrase. And certainly I came to understand it about how the slave trade originates in the Congo Kingdom, right? And so what Amin says is that he says it's neocolonialism is outward directed colonial development. I want you to unpack that. What the hell does he mean by outward directed neocolonialism, and how does that contribute to the underdevelopment of particular African societies and civilizations and the underdevelopment of Africa in totality?
Dependent societies export raw materials and natural resources in order to get the international currency that is needed to buy and sell on the world market. So the Europeans and the North Americans have rigged world trade so that in order to get access to the Bretton Woods currency, which is the US dollar, the currency that is backed up by Saudi Arabian petroleum for now,
In the U.S. military.
yeah, and NATO. Uh, in order to get access to the U.S. those U.S. dollars, you have to export whatever natural resources you have, and the price of those natural resources is usually not set inside the exporting country. The prices of those natural resources are set by the cartels, like the conglomerates of the buyers. So the
Which
people
are
who,
European and American.
yeah, even as something
But name them, man.
as something as simple as selling coca leaves, the price is not set by the Peruvians and the Colombians and the Brazilians that grow the coca leaves. The price is set by the Mexicans, who are the junior partners of the American drug sellers.
You know, something, when I first went to Ghana in 2004, that I discovered the average Ghanaian cannot afford to buy a, a, uh, a candy bar made from cocoa. They
That's
can't
grown
afford,
right there.
they can't afford to buy it. Yeah. So that's the outward development. Okay.
That
So
and that
what is
is
the consequences for African, South Central, and North America, since Mexico is in North America, and Asian and the islands of the sea by this form of neocolonialism that economically is outward directed development? And then we can talk about the politics of it. What are the consequences?
the consequences are that we do not trade with each other. We do not have in the decision making circles of the junior partners of the European, Japanese, and North American empires. We do not have people thinking about creating a common currency, and we do not have people thinking about abolishing borders so that we can have a single market. And whenever somebody does think about those things, like Nkrumah and Gaddafi or Thomas Sankara, the Europeans and the North Americans assassinate them.
That's right. That's
So,
yeah.
the obstacle to sovereign sovereignty and self-sufficiency is these borders that were created by colonialism, and these borders that are sustained by the NATO empire. And the other obstacle is the lack of a common market. The United States is a common market inside its borders, and now they've annexed Canada and Mexico, which are like colonies of the United States. And they
Like, like colonies.
they've also annexed Europe because places like Germany have been deindustrialized in the last 2 years.
That's what Huey Newton, when he introduced the concept of intercommunalism, he argued that the U.S. had become an empire that had reduced all other nation states to the status of communities, which was synonym for colonies. And that's where we are. Okay, I want to pull back and further develop this argument that you were laying out in terms of outward directed colonial development, neocolonialism, right? So, in talking about West Africa, and in the book, Neocolonialism in West Africa, that Amin wrote, he talks. Well, here's the quote. He says that the overriding obstacle to development is the division of this area, i.e., West Africa, into 9 states. End quote. C.L.R. James makes a similar argument when he says that the problem in the Caribbean is fragmentation in these 13 or 14 island nation states, right? So would you agree with Amin that the central problem is the acceptance of this fragmentation of regions that have greater ethnic, national, and well, maybe not national, but ethnic and cultural unity to be divided into the states that the Europeans had created to continue that? And I want to bring you to a specific political question. And I hope this is, I don't lose anybody in this argument, but the question is that when the first African countries gained their independence in the 50s, there's 2 moves, right? There's the move by Nkrumah, Ben Bella, Nasser, the Casablanca group. And they're saying we need to go straight toward unity. And then there's the Monrovia group that says, we should not give up individual state independence. We should find ways to cooperate and collaborate, right? And so if the central question is, as Amin said, the fragmentation, right? His quote is, the overriding obstacle to development is the division of this area into 9 nation states. Can you talk to me about the Casablanca Monrovia division and what it meant that the radicals of Casablanca lost in the formation of initially the Organization of African Unity and what is now called the African Union after the European Union?
During the period in which these conflictive ideas were being debated about cooperation versus unification, Samir Amin was directing a United Nations school for public administrators in Dakar. And one of the problems that he recognized and he acknowledged is that it was very difficult for the children of the national bourgeoisie or for the children of the nationalist bourgeoisie to see past their noses. He couldn't think in regional or continental terms. They only thought in the nation that they were going to control and sell down the drain as if it was their private plantation, whether it was Nigeria or Liberia or Senegal or Mauritania or Mali. The Mali and Senegal had a quick minute of trying to federate, but it didn't work out because Senghor was not a committed socialist.
Wait a minute. Nkrumah creates a federation between Ghana, Guinea, and Mali, right? Under Modibo Keita, a descendant of Sunjata Keita. And the CFA explodes that confederation, right?
that worked a lot better than the relation between Senegal and Mali.
Okay.
And the what Samir Amin recognized in the course of developing this United Nations institution was that it was an obstacle to development. It was an obstacle to economic sovereignty and to the redistribution of wealth to people, for people who were making decisions to think only of these artificial borders that had been created by the Europeans who occupied the Europeans and the North Americans, because the Canadians and the United States have their foot on the neck of everything, every decision maker on the African continent as well. Let's suffice it to mention that 3/4 of the mining companies in the world are Canadian.
Yes.
So it's not just the problem of the boundaries that is identified in this accurate quote that you mentioned, but it's also the problem of the tariffs.
Speak to that. Speak to
If
that.
you if you eliminate the tariffs between the countries in West Africa, it's possible to improve trade. And
Now,
if you
the last time I was in Tanzania, which would have been 2015, right? And I had the occasion to meet the brother who was the director for political affairs for the East African uh, community. Is it ECOWAS?
No, ECOWAS is in West Africa.
Okay, ECOWAS
In
in Western. What's the
in
one
East
in East Africa?
in East Africa, it was Uganda, Kenya, and Tanzania.
No, there's five. They got five now. And so one of the things that this
Probably Rwanda, probably Rwanda, which are the lapdogs of the Ugandans.
okay, so what he made clear to me, David is his name, was that now this was 2015. He said in 5 years there will be a common passport for the five nations, and specifically, I think Ethiopia was the other one. So I think it was Ethiopia, Tanzania, Uganda, Kenya, and one other place that they would have a common passport. And he said that 5 years after that, they would have the same currency. And so his argument was that they were going to unify the continent regionally before they brought it together. Now, that's something that Nyeri talked about as part of the Monrovia group.
Yeah.
And that didn't happen, right? And so what I'm wondering is, do you have to go with Nkrumah and Nasser and do this shit all at once?
Uh, I I think Gaddafi, uh, who's the most recent example of this effort, was going to start a common currency.
Right.
And if you start with a common currency, then the other components, like having a common market,
Passport
is
is market.
is easier. And from having a common market, then you can uh, make uniform the conditions of production, and you can start a continental network to negotiate the prices of what you export to Europe, and you can have a relation with the Southern Cone, which is most of South America, in order to uh, coordinate your negotiations with Europe and North America about what you sell and at what price. One of the reasons why Gaddafi was assassinated is not just so that Mrs. Clinton and Obama could steal the national treasure, which
Right.
was the basis for the common currency, but it was also to interrupt this process for the common currency. There are people in Senegal at the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation which have been writing about the need to stop using currencies that have been imposed by the Europeans or who are pegged to the euro in order to operate internationally. And that's going to happen in Senegal now because the new president is committed to delinking from the euro and delinking from the French National Bank.
Okay, wonderful response. I want to ask this question, and it's about Eurocentrism. And it's interesting that you mentioned that you had early on that Eurocentrism was one of the works by Samir Amin that you had read early on.
Yeah.
So I'm finishing up class today, and the class is History 276, Afro 276, Black America since 1877, right? And we're in the last part. Only got one more day to teach, so I'm teaching about the critical incidents that create the third or the new nadir of Afro America. And a student comes up to me and she wants to do extra credit after the class, and she says, "Can I write on the work of damn?" This man, this woman, Frances Cress Welsing. So can I write on the work of Frances Cress Welsing? And because I believe that student, you can learn from anything, right? I said, yes, you can.
Why not?
But my heart was like, it's gonna be some bullshit. So here's where I'm going. Frances Cress Welsing's argument, right, is a psychological is a biopsycho argument about Europeans being racist as a consequence of the size of their racial group relative to the size of the number of the darker peoples on the planet, right? And it's an ahistorical argument because it doesn't identify the origin of racism. It's an argument that from the very beginning, once Europeans saw the rest of the world, they were racist. Right? Okay. Samir Amin defines Eurocentrism, and this is the way he defines. He says Eurocentrism is a specifically modern phenomena, the roots of which go back only to the Renaissance, a phenomenon that did not flourish until the 19th century, right? In this sense, it constitutes one dimension of the culture and ideology of modern capitalist world, period, end quote, right? That's what he says in Eurocentrism. Now, what's embedded in his definition is a historical argument about the origin, right, of Eurocentrism. It begins in the Renaissance. He says it doesn't really flourish until the 19th century, right? And he locates it as part of the history of capitalism. Now, that's very different than what Frances Cress Welsing and a number of other folk who follow that line of argumentation do. So what I want you to respond to, what's important about the ways in which Samir Amin traces Eurocentrism historically and how he locates it economically and politically for revolutionary Black folk. I should follow Frances Cress Welsing into an abyss.
I think that one of the problems that North American intellectuals have is that they only read in English, and they only read stuff, for the most part. I'm not generalizing, but for the most part, only read stuff that's produced in North America. So Samir could read in French and in English, and I suspect that he understood Portuguese. which means that if he understood Portuguese, he could also read in Spanish. In the 19th century, there were people in England and in Germany who were proposing that uh, there was only one island. There were only two islands in the world. One is an island that connected Asia and Europe and Africa. That's all. That's all one island. And that if you control that one island, if you control the center of that one island, you can control the world economy. And geopolitics is based on that notion. The first geopolitical analysts were people in England and in Germany who started with that premise.
The Scots, the Scots were tremendous political economists, right?
Yeah, yeah. But geopolitical perspective means that you have to combine geography and relations of power. And that approach with regards to Eurasia starts in the 19th century in Germany and in England. The British called this the Great Game, and for them, the Great Game was getting to control Iran and getting to control Saudi Arabia. If they control that, they would control world trade.
But let me bring you back. Why is it important that for Samir Amin, eurocentrism is tied to capitalism and is not some free-floating ideology that's simply attached to a body, i.e., white folks and white supremacy? Why is it important that he locates it as having its roots in the Renaissance, but not flourishing until the 19th century?
It's during the Renaissance, or the Renaissance is a consequence of Marco Polo going to China and coming back with the printing press and coming back with paper and coming back with gunpowder, and that makes it possible for the Europeans to start thinking about how the hell do we get over there without having to walk from Italy to
Yeah.
China the way that Marco Polo did. And so they start traveling around Africa. Columbus was an Italian
But
charged.
let me stop you here and pause.
Go ahead.
Frances Cress Welsing covers all of that. And she says that when they went over there, they saw that all the people were dark. Everywhere they went, they saw the people was dark. And that led them to become racist. Why is that argument wrong?
That argument is wrong in the first chapter of Black Marxism by Cedric Robinson, where Cedric explains that the concept of race was invented by the first capitalists in Europe, in Germany, in Italy, in France, in England, because they needed to justify paying the people who lived outside the city walls. They needed to justify paying their workers less, and if they invented this notion that these were subhuman creatures, especially the Eastern Europeans, which is the etymological origin of the word slave, they were Slavs. And if you invent these categories like caste and race based on people's physical features or their language or where they come from, you can justify, it doesn't explain a damn thing, but you can justify paying them less, and that's how capitalism developed. Capitalism developed by exploitation, by paying the workers less than the value of their work. And
I'm telling you, my students are more likely, right, particularly if they don't take classes with about 4 people at the U of I, right? Lou Turner, my wife, and a couple other people. They're likely to find Frances Cress Welsing, the idea that Europeans went around the world and they saw that everybody was dark, and they said, we're a minority, we hate those other people, we can never be like them, therefore we're going to conquer them and suppress them. They find that a easier argument to accept than an argument that you and Samir Amin are posing, that it's tied to commodity production. It's tied to exchange in terms of ripping off people's mineral wealth and cash crops and shit, and that it becomes an explanation for capitalism.
And if you understand that the basis of wealth accumulation is exploitation, and race is a way of justifying exploitation, then this other argument that this person that you mentioned, whose name I can't repeat, uh,
Francis Chris,
there, the argument that starts with exploitation explains history. The argument that this woman is making describes an event outside any historical context, and it doesn't answer who profits and why do they profit. Neither of those questions are answered by this superficial descriptive approach.
okay,
Whereas,
thank you. That's
whereas,
it.
whereas Samir and Cedric, use history to explain the causes connected to the consequences. And anybody who's using history has to be able to identify who profits from this mess and how do we make this regime unprofitable.
Okay. Thank you, my brother. I do want to ask you one quick question, but I want a short answer to it before I go to the chat. And that is about your own work. Because it's interesting. I've had you on twice, and we've never talked about what you do in terms of your contemporary work, right? So you are writing down on Vulture Capitalism. So first, I know the metaphor from Malcolm, right? That you have to be a capitalist, you have to be vulturistic. But tell me, what are you doing? What is this work studying vulture capitalism, and what's the problem with that?
In the in the decade that Obama was the fronting for the American empire, the colonial administration in my country had to declare bankruptcy, and they were between 70 and 100 billion dollars in debt that they couldn't pay. And so the Obama administration imposed on one of their overseas colonies a fiscal control board that is going to administer the reduction of the public budget. The national budget is going to be reduced and the taxes are going to be raised in order to pay the foreign investors in the public debt their investments. And that kind of austerity regime that's imposed by the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund in the foreign colonies is being imposed on a domestic overseas colony through this scheme that the Obama administration invented called the Fiscal Control Board. And they've already reduced the budget of the National University by a third. And they're going to reduce the budget for the hospitals, for the health system, and the budget for the police department, and the budget, which is no big thing. The police should disappear, at least the colonial police, so that we could create self-defense units.
Right.
But they've slashed the budget for every public service, the pension funds, and the university system, for example, has an autonomous pension system that works better than anything else in the country. And the colonial administration is trying to get that money in order to pay the vulture funds. The vulture funds have imposed a law in Puerto Rico that makes it possible for foreigners who want to live there without paying taxes can do so if they live there 6 months out of the year. So a lot of Yankees are moving to our country so as to avoid paying taxes to the federal government, and they don't pay taxes in Puerto Rico either. But they meet once a month in order to concoct a list of local politicians that they're going to bribe, that they're going to pay
Mm.
their electoral campaigns. And what I was asked to do by the expatriate community network, those of us who are forced to live out of the country because we're political exiles, or because we're economic migrants, or because we're environmental refugees, uh, they asked me to investigate who are these vulture funds that have invested in the debt of our country, so that we can boycott the enterprises that they invest in, not just what they do in Puerto Rico, but what they do abroad. One of those vulture funds, BlackRock, for example, owns most of the real estate in Madrid, in Spain, and they also own the New York Times. Just
Okay.
to give you an example, these are the same vulture funds that bankrupted the city of Detroit, and they invest in Illinois, in the campaigns of your senior senator to the U.S. Senate.
Of course they do. That criminal. Thank you, Brother Santiago. I just want to add a quick comment, then I want to go to the chat. Uh, and we're gonna go a little bit over time today.
Do we
But
have to make
I was in your homeland, Puerto Rico, back in the spring for a wedding of Monica White, the scholar. The book was Freedom Farmers, right?
I know
And
her. I know her from when she was a student in your school.
well, that's right. That's right. So you go back with Monica almost as far back as I do. I go back to like 96, 97 with Mo White. Um, but we were there for her wedding, and one of the things, I'm talking to people on the street and Uber drivers and stuff, and one of the things that I'm told, which is later confirmed by a student that I work with here, Carlos Sanabria Viaz, that these petty bourgeois are going into Puerto Rico and they're buying up Airbnbs. And in doing that, they're having the impact where they not only drive up the housing costs, right, which leads to gentrification, but that the small businesses in the area, right, respond to the invasion of North Americans by only hiring people who are bilingual, and that leads to a disproportionate employment of white folk. And you can just see how these vulture funds have an impact that not only sucks up money, but also transforms the nature of the labor force in terms of race and class.
And there's two consequences that you can discuss with your student. In addition to gentrification, you can talk about apartheid. There are
Yeah,
towns in our country, not, not just Old San Juan, but the Condado, Rincon, Dorado, Vieques, Culebra, which are towns that are predominantly controlled by foreign residents and by foreign employers. And they're
I
not
definitely saw
only
that with Old San
gentrifying.
Juan.
Yeah, Old San Juan is a white neighborhood controlled by
Yeah,
Yankee foreigners,
yeah, yeah.
and it's an apartheid system. The other aspect that is in the cause and consequence continuum is the genocide by population substitution. This is a based on
Elaborate on that.
this is based on a speech that was given by Fanon's teacher, Aimé Césaire, in the Paris Parliament in 1975, in which he demonstrated that the influx of French citizens into Martinique and Guadeloupe was forcing the Martinicans and the Guadeloupans to leave the country. And this is
Mm,
what's happening in Puerto Rico. In the last 4 years, at least 600,000 people have left.
wow.
Now we have 2/3 of our population. That's 6 million people who are living outside our country, and only 3 million people living inside our country. It's no mystery or no difficult to understand why we are in solidarity with the people of Western Sahara, with the people of Kashmir, with the people of Palestine, because we're suffering the same process of genocide by population substitution. What the Moroccans are doing to the Sahrawis, what the Zionists are doing to the Palestinians, is exactly what the American empire is doing to us.
Wow,
and
man.
and you can go to Division Street in Chicago and see what self-sufficiency and economic sovereignty looks like in our community of nearly 100,000 people in the north side of
Hmm.
Chicago. But we can't do that in our own country because the laws that the American empire forces us to either leave as economic migrants, as political exiles, or as environmental refugees.
Wow, man.
I've met my compatriots. I've met my compatriots in Paris, in Spain, in Egypt, in Tanzania, in Kenya. My barber was a Puerto Rican woman.
Damn. Wow.
And we're all over the world. In
You know,
Argentina, when I lived in Buenos Aires, I stayed at the home of a Puerto Rican pastor. In Peru, I stayed at the home of Puerto Ricans. In Venezuela, in Mexico, in Panama, wherever there are people who need work to be done, there's people from my country to do it. Just like the Sahrawis are all over North Africa, and just like the Palestinians are all over the Arab world.
this is the irony, right? And then we want to go to the chat. But the irony is that Europeans, Euro Americans had this racist chant that they call "You won't replace us." But the truth is, they have a history of forcing the darker peoples out of their places and invading, right? And they invade, commit genocide, or force us out. And then they create a fucking chant talking about people are replacing them. You know what I mean? The hypocrisy, the irony. All right, my brother. So we got stuff in the chat. Most of it is people just amazed at what your intellectual contribution. But some of it is what my good sister Ingrid Craven used to call the dumb shit. So there are real questions, but I'm going to start with this. So one from Norman Richmond, he asked this question. He said, "What lessons can we learn from Oliver Cox?" And I think he means 2024, that have been forgotten by the Black left today. So, what can we learn from Cox? And there's a chapter in Black
The
Marxism on Cox, right? By Cedric.
Yes,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
yes.
So,
The relation
what is
the
Cox?
relationship
What do we
between
apply today? That's what Richmond wants to know.
the relationship between race and class that's developed by Oliver Cromwell Cox when he was teaching in Detroit. When he was teaching in the South, it was very
Wayne State.
difficult for him to. Yeah, when he was at Wayne State, this set of reflections that he conducted about the relationship between race and class that Cedric Robinson picks up on. Cedric learned about this relationship between race and class from interacting with the South African exiles in London while he was working there on Black Marxism. But Neville Alexander is one of the South African intellectuals who develops the same uh, evidence based research about the relationship between race and class between Oliver Cromwell Cox, Cedric Robinson, and Neville Alexander are the bibliographical basis to talk about racial capitalism, which is quite in the currency now, but it has to do with this conclusion that if you want to end racism, you also have to end the capitalist system.
Okay. Now I got a question that's difficult in the sense that it clearly evidences some things that are true, but it also masks a deeper understanding. So it's the question is technology is mainly, well, actually it's not a question, it's a statement. Technology is mainly how the powerful control the powerless. Once empires and states controlled technology, it was only a matter of time before oppression went international. As a Marxist, how would you respond to an argument of technological determinism, which this question is, which this statement is?
Technology and artificial intelligence and robotics are going to destroy half of the jobs that existed worldwide in 2013 within the next 5 years. Let me repeat that to make sure it sinks in.
Yeah.
Half of the jobs that existed in 2013 are going to disappear in the next 5 years. That means that most of the people who are going to university now are never going to have a job.
Okay,
Now, what
but
is it that we can do
that seems
about
to
that?
be that seems
In,
to be in
in another,
agreement with this argument. I'm
no,
seeking.
I'm not in agreeing with.
Okay, good. Well, get at this question about the argument is about technology as an independent variable, right? And it seems to me, right? And I'm working off of most importantly the Harry Braverman text, right? Labor and Monopoly Capital, but also David Gordon's work, right? Wonderful, wonderful work, and the whole group of people who come under the notion of social structures of accumulation. That whole group, Richard Reich, David Gordon, those folks, right? The argument that capitalists only introduced technology as a response to labor struggle. My great friend Lou Turner, you know Lou. Lou makes the argument that the
Yes.
move to global financialized racial capital is a response to Black worker struggles and wildcats, right? Which transcend Black workers, including other folk, right? In the 1970s. And so the move toward globalization is in part stimulated by the resistance of workers keyed by Black workers. So that technology is introduced only when it can help save costs, cut labor costs. And that's what most technology does. And that's what your answer was, that the technology, AI, is going to slash the labor force in half. So if technology is an instrument wielded as a club or a sieve or a machete, cutting the working people and severing them, then technology is not the issue. The issue is the capitalist use and development of technology. The technology reflects their values, not the values of humanity. That's what I'm trying to drive at, Santiago.
Since since the 1940s and the 1950s, the group of scholars in the United States, activist scholars that worked in small collectives connected with social movements, developed a way of looking at history that demonstrated that the historical initiative was with the working classes, with the producers of wealth, and that the capitalists responded to the strategic initiatives of the working classes in Europe, in North America, in Latin America, in Asia, and in Africa. And if the workers are the ones that have the initiative and then the capitalists react, it's possible to understand solutions and alternatives to the existing order. If technology is developed in order to repress the initiatives of the workers, then the workers can use the technology in order to seek new routes of self sufficiency and sovereignty. And it's up to the intelligence and the creativity of the working classes to invent alternatives to the way technology is used now. Te- Technology can be used to help the workers or it can be used to help the employers, but it's our choice. I'll give an illustration or an example of how to illustrate this. If somebody is coming at you with a machete and they have the wooden part of the sword in their hand, grab onto the other end, even if it hurts for a quick minute, but you can use the other end to stick the wooden part into your attacker's chest. That's using the technology in your interest against the interest of those who are wielding the technology to destroy the self sufficiency and the sovereignty efforts of the working classes.
Okay, thank you for that answer. I'm going to the next to another question. Oh, wait a minute. This is from the same person. I don't want to go to another question from the same person. So let me move. Okay, I got Priester John, a person that's been with us for a long time, and he asked, "Why is there so little resistance to a BRICS alternative currency? Some suggest that BRICS will help save global capitalism under a new digital system, a central bank digital currency system." Can you respond to that?
The plan, as I understand it, based on the work of Pepe Escobar, uh, the plan of the BRICS is to develop an alternative currency within the next 5 to 6 years. What they're doing now is encouraging the countries that are part of the BRICS network to use their own currencies instead of using the dollar as an intermediation, to use UN or to use rubles or to use reis, which is the currency in Brazil, instead of having to go through the dollar. They're also going to develop an alternative to the SWIFT network of international commerce controlled by the Europeans and the North Americans. And again, the plan is to develop within the next 5 to 6 years an alternative to the US dollar supported by gold. And that includes Saudi Arabia, by the way.
Okay, Brother Santiago, I don't even know if people can hear me because I've
Yes,
frozen.
yes, I can hear you.
You can hear me, okay, but you see that we are both frozen, and I can't scroll any further on in terms of comments. I don't know what this is, but uh, can I get you to give a kind of final statement since I can't scroll and see new comments and
I,
we're frozen? So can you give a final comment and then we'll just bring it to an end? Um,
what I would like to say in closing is that I read something about your uh, colleague Cross. I read some sections of Shades of Black, and I think that in order to get at some of the process questions that he presents in that book, it might be useful to explore the work of Franz Fanon that he mentions twice in the book, and Paulo Freire, who's not mentioned at all, and Amilcar Cabral, who I didn't find mentioned, but I admit that I haven't finished reading, in order to get at the relationship between social consciousness, historical memories, and collective identity, because I don't think these processes can be addressed by individuals. That's my first comment. And my last comment
Mm.
is that the the point of departure for this effort that we're conducting about history as a weapon, I think needs to address the relationship between war and capital and the state. Unless we can explain
Mm.
the relationships between permanent war and the accumulation of wealth in order to produce the technology that allows the state to have standing armies and uniformed mercenaries in our neighborhoods, it will be difficult to invent an alternative to the existing order, which at least in North America is sinking and becoming increasingly dysfunctional. And that's our work.
Brother, I want to thank you for that. I think that was very succinct and it gets us toward where we want to go. And I would end by saying that I don't think either you or I at this point would describe ourselves as Leninists, but I think it would be untrue if we said we weren't deeply influenced by Lenin. And Lenin's argument about the state is that it is an instrument, a weapon of the ruling class, right? And I think that's what you essentially just said, that
Yeah.
it is a weapon of the ruling class. And that class also introduces technology in order to further and cement its rule. So let me thank you. And I hate that that things have frozen and I can't do anything. I don't even know. Okay, it's spinning now. Let's just wait a couple minutes and see what it's if it becomes possible to look at a few more comments, and if we can, we'll run it to 9, and then we'll end it sharply at 9. I hate to go over, but it was so good, right? And what you had to say, and the interest is so great that I do want to come back to that. So this thing is spinning, and shit, I don't know.
Somebody says here, uh, fire is technology, and you're in the show. Everyone can see and hear you.
Okay,
I
is
don't I don't know what any of that means.
I still got something that's spinning, but it did move. I'm seeing different stuff a bit, although I'm still frozen and you're still frozen, but people can hear us.
Yeah.
So that's interesting. All right, I'm gonna give it like a minute, and if it doesn't change, actually, I don't know if I can close it. I'll try. Okay, what the hell?
There's another part of dependency that we hadn't talked about, Sundiata, that we might just think about while we're waiting for the machinery to come alive again. One is the dependency on foreign aid.
Okay, here's the thing. Can I've got you, but I don't have me. I can hear you. I can see you. Okay, now I'm adding me. I don't add to the stage. I just got you. Santiago, can you speak?
Yeah.
Okay, why am I? You don't like my music, far as technology. Is somebody else on?
No.
Okay, let me see what's going on here. My man, what appears to be the situation?
There. Where are you now? How's it going, Sundiata?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I can't bring myself back in where, we went overtime for a purpose, but this is, we now don't have control of what's here. I can't make myself come in, hide current. So I'm going to wrap it up. Thank everyone for coming. My brother, uh, love you, everything. Great conversation. I'll get back with you. We trying to go to West Africa, Northern West Africa next year with you. All
Thank
right.
you. Thank
Later,
you.
good people. We're
Today
in.
today's the anniversary of the revolution of the Carnations in Portugal.
Power.